Good morning and welcome to the second Sunday of Advent. People and places have reputations. We are familiar with phrases like, that's a ritzy neighborhood or the wrong side of the tracks. And maybe we're familiar with some of the cities seeking to revitalize their downtown, or maybe you're familiar with the idea of gentrification, which, depending upon whose perspective you listen to, is a great thing or a terrible thing. We might improve a neighborhood, but at what cost to the current inhabitants? Regardless, most people would say that it takes a lot of money and time to change a place's reputation. We might say it takes even more to change a person's reputation. Impressions that we have about others are hard to change, good or bad. We stand in disbelief when someone we've trusted for years betrays us. We might be willing to forgive, but we find it hard to forget and trust someone who had shown themselves to be untrustworthy over and over again. And of course, I think we know ourselves. We know that sin usually doesn't disappear overnight when we come to believe in Jesus. So what is our hope? Do we have any expectation that we or someone else might undo a reputation? Well, there's a series of stories in the Old Testament that I think might be helpful to us this Advent season. And it concerns a place that has gained a poor reputation, despite its name. Names, of course, don't always play out the way we'd like. Take the city of Philadelphia, for instance. It is the city of brotherly love, is what that word means. But it sits in the top 10 cities in the country for murders per capita. Hardly brotherly or loving. This morning we're going to talk about another place whose name means something. But we need to cover a decent bit of ground this morning first to get the big picture. The place is called Bethlehem. In Hebrew, we would pronounce it Beit Lechem. It means house of bread. The name conjures up pictures of lush fields, of flowing grain, and the prosperity that would come from those fertile fields. It's a homey place. The smells remind you of Grandma's house when you walk in and a loaf of bread is just coming out of the oven. It's the place you want to be, or at least it should be. But during the period of the Judges, God tells us 3 stories where Bethlehem is either mentioned or is the central location in the story. Now, we're not going to read all those chapters that talk about Bethlehem, but I do want to quickly summarize the first 2 stories in Judges, and then we'll look with a little more detail at the third, which is the book of Ruth. So I apologize in advance if we feel a bit of whiplash this morning, as we went from 4 verses last week to about 9 chapters this morning, but let's dive in. The first story begins in Judges 17 and 18. There is a Levite. That's someone who is of the family of Moses and Aaron. And he basically allows his services, his priestly services, to be sold to the highest bidder, or we might say sold to the most powerful. And the text says that this man is currently living in Bethlehem. Now, certainly this is more of a commentary on the man and those who are vying for his services than on the town of Bethlehem itself, but as we'll see, this slight blot on the place is going to grow. And so these 2 chapters are just a subtle hint that all is not right here. For why is a Levite there anyway? In Numbers 35, Moses set aside 48 cities scattered throughout Israel for which the Levites were to dwell, as they had no inheritance in the land like the other tribes. And so who is in charge that has turned a blind eye or is unaware of what's going on in Bethlehem? Was this Levite not being cared for as he should have been by the inhabitants, so that he had to flee and sell his services? The house of bread is not to him, anyway, a place of abundance. The second story also is tangentially related to Bethlehem, and it begins in chapter 19. A Levite takes a concubine from the town of Bethlehem. Again, we're talking about the priestly people. And this sets off a series of horrific events: rape, murder, near genocide, kidnapping. And here it doesn't seem to be Bethlehem's fault in any way, but still, stories get started. In the past 13 years, when we tell people that we lived in Central Texas for several years near a town called Waco, what people more often than not mention is the Branch Davidian fiasco. There are a lot of things to associate with Waco. The Dr. Pepper Museum, the Texas Ranger Museum, more recently, Chip and Joanna Gaines. But it's the black spot of David Koresh and the Branch Davidians that people, at least people from here, associate with Waco. And so I can hear the story about Bethlehem. That disaster with that tribe of Benjamin, well, that all started with a girl from Bethlehem. And both of these stories tell us that there was no king in Israel, that everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so during the time of the judges, Bethlehem, like so many other places, was ruled much like our culture is ruled, by the dictates of an unanchored worldview of what is right and what is wrong. It sounds good to me. I'll be happy to jump right in. And then we come to the book of Ruth, where Bethlehem is front and center. And things aren't any better. The house of bread is in the midst of a famine. I'm sure the locals got tired of hearing that joke. And a man takes his family out of Israel. He's not waiting around for the town to live up to its name, and he dies in a foreign land. And apparently he dies without making sure that his kids understood that they are supposed to marry inside the family of Israel. And so the two sons take wives from the Moabites, and then the two sons also die, and eventually the mom and her two daughters-in-law hear, after a 10-year period, that God has finally visited his people with bread, and so they set out for home, at least home for the mom. Certainly not home for the two daughters-in-law. And on the way, mom realizes that there is no hope for a good life for the girls. No protection, no support, and the two girls would be better off staying put. And even when one of the girls agrees to return with Naomi, Naomi returns bitter and angry and feeling abandoned by everyone, including God. The house of bread seems an empty promise to her. Even if the fields are finally full again after the famine, what hope does she have? They may be full, but they're full for someone else, not her. The promises of God may be good for you, but not for me. God has dealt me a bitter hand. And I imagine some of you can relate to that. From family situations that seem out of control, to health situations that aren't resolving, to life just not going the way that you pictured or hoped that it might, or hoped that it would. Disappointment is common to us all, and great disappointment is, unfortunately, not a rare occurrence in this life. If you are looking for your hopes, if you are looking for your house of bread and only finding bitterness or the temptation toward bitterness, then the rest of this story is for you. You see, despite Naomi's bitterness, Ruth heads out to the fields intending to work for her bread and keep them from starving. But is this really a long-term solution? What Ruth is doing is the cultural activity of gleaning. She's visiting the fields and picking up what is dropped or left over or looked over. It's the culture's way, that culture's way of providing for the poor. But what happens when the harvest is actually over? Gleaning only happens at certain times of the year. Starvation may be put off today, but what about tomorrow? But she goes today because today matters in her mind. And what she finds is kindness from the owner of the field, Boaz. Her work ethic and her situation catches his notice, and when Ruth comes home that night, Naomi is smart enough to know that Ruth couldn't have done what she did on her own. Someone, Naomi asserts, must have taken notice of Ruth. And when Ruth relays the story, Naomi remembers something. Oh, he's a relative of ours. And then she begins to hatch a plan that maybe, just maybe, might allow them to avoid destitution and poverty. Naomi has Ruth offer herself to Boaz. Propose, so to speak. Call him to uphold the family name as is required in the Old Testament law for men to carry on the name of a deceased relative. And Boaz actually agrees to this plan, except he's actually not first in line to take care of Naomi and this daughter-in-law. There is apparently a relative who is closer in relation to Naomi than Boaz, and so this other guy gets first dibs on both a piece of land and the girl. And so the next morning, Boaz calls the town elders together along with this other guy and presents the case. And at first, when just the land is mentioned, the other fellow is all in. But then Boaz brings up Ruth and the importance of raising up the name of the deceased, and here this other guy refuses. You see, he doesn't want to jeopardize his own inheritance. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's say this other fellow marries Ruth and has a kid. Well, this kid is technically Chilion's kid, right? Naomi's son. And if this is the only kid that this fellow has, well, where does his inheritance go? How does his name get passed on? And so he refuses. Too much of a risk. But Boaz is willing to take the risk. Not because he's a gambler, because he thinks it'll work out okay, but because he is an honorable man and does what is right. You see, God has told him how to respond to those in need, and he's obedient. Here is someone from the house of bread who takes seriously his responsibility to help others flourish, to nourish others. You see, obedience is not a risk. And in that culture, in that time, it was okay to weigh the cost-benefit of obedience. Everyone did, after all, what was right in his own eyes. But Boaz follows in obedience. Now, we need to zoom out the camera a bit. When we do, we find that this whole episode is nothing special. You see, I'm sure that Elimelech's family wasn't the only family who left during the famine. I'm sure that Naomi wasn't the only widow who felt bitterness toward God, and I'm sure that Ruth wasn't the only girl who was out winnowing in the fields. You see, in the grand scheme of things, it's just a story of people doing what people do. They live, they love, they struggle, and they die. And they usually don't see beyond the moment they are in. But God recorded this particular story for us. And he recorded the two stories before this one to remind us of something. He is in control. You see, whatever reputation Bethlehem had, when we think of Bethlehem today, hardly anyone would think of the idolatry of the Levite or the murdered concubine. No, Bethlehem reminds us of the Christmas story, right? You know the song. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Right? For Jesus was born in the house of bread. But why? Well, because he was a descendant of David. And God had orchestrated that he wanted Mary and Joseph back in David's hometown for the birth. Because the house of bread was going to have a permanent change of reputation. Forever now it would be known as the birthplace of the bread of life. But how did we get from this story to David, and how is it important to think about and here it is important to think about the genealogy that is included at the end of the story. You see, Naomi had no idea what would come of her scheming. Ruth had no idea what would come of her willingness to go to work. Boaz had no idea what would come of his willingness to marry this widow and potentially jeopardize his inheritance. For he did have a son. And the women were thrilled and even said to Naomi, a son has been born to Naomi. Notice that it's not a son has been born to Boaz. For this is technically not his son, but Chilion's son. But then we come to verses 21 and 22 of chapter 4, where we see a genealogy. And surely the scribe made a mistake, for there in print for all to see is Boaz's name. Boaz, not Chilion, is the father of Obed. You see, Boaz was willing to die to self, and when he did, his name was raised up as the great-grandfather of a king. And this king, David, as we see in the genealogy, had a promise made to him. God told him, one of your descendants will reign on your throne forever. And because of this king, Jesus, who was born in Bethlehem, it's not just a place that has had its reputation changed. We have a chance to have our reputations changed as well. For we were dead men and women, sinners who had earned the penalty of eternal wrath for our rebellion against God's good rule. And Boaz points us to the truth. When you die to self, you are raised up. And Jesus died the ultimate death, being willing to take on our sin, our rebellion. He sacrificed his rights to identify with us, and then he was raised up, and now all who place their faith in his death and resurrection are called by his name. It's a miraculous turn of events. What was stained has been washed clean. What was broken has been made whole. What was torn has been mended. What was dead has been made alive, has been made new. And so we no longer hope in places or other people. We hope in the one Boaz pointed to, the one born in the house of bread, that we might be made new and have our reputations washed clean. Father, thank you for stories such as this that remind us that tragedy can become hope, and that faithful people can make a difference in this world. That you use faithful people to bring glory and honor to your Son, our Savior. And it is for his glory that we thank you and praise you and seek to live a life of obedience to you. Amen.